How's it going, church? Welcome to another Devo. We are in the book of Isaiah, the rich prophetic book of Isaiah, chapter 10 today, verses 5 through 19. It is a fairly long passage, so I will not be reading it out loud, but I will read one verse that I believe summarizes this chapter. So I would pause the video, take some time to read through verses 5 through 19. But I'm just going to read verse 12, where it says, "When the Lord has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes." And I think this summarizes the whole chapter, because hopefully you read it, you paused it. He's basically talking about Assyria and their pride. If I go into a deeper breakdown, verses 5 through 6 is saying that the Assyrians are going to be part of God's judgment. It says, the rod of my anger, whose hand is in the club of my wrath. And he's going to send them against a godless nation. And God, what is he talking about? God is going to use Assyria to bring judgment upon Judah, which is the southern kingdom of Israel. Because they're a wicked people. They are prideful, they were adulterous, they were idolatrous, and they just turned away from God. So God is using Assyria. But if you read verse 7, it says, but this is not what he intends, and this is not what he has in mind. And essentially, verse 7 is saying the Assyrians don't know that they are under God's control here. They don't know that they're being used as an instrument of God for his judgment. And because they don't know, in verses 9 through 11, they're basically boasting in themselves. They're boasting in who they are. I know the language seems a little funny, but when he says in verse 8, "Are not my commanders all kings?" he's saying, even the commanders of the army of Assyria, they consider them kings over all the nations because they believe that's how great they were. And in the next verse, in verse 9, you see all these names of countries or cities, and it's just they're recounting the spoils. They're recounting who they've conquered. And in the verse 10 and 11, they're remembering again, Assyria has wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you didn't know, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, northern and southern. And like I said, God is bringing judgment upon the southern kingdom because the northern kingdom, Israel, is already wiped out. And the capital of Israel was Samaria. And that's why in verse 11 says, "Shall I not deal with Jerusalem and her images as I dealt with Samaria and her idols?" Because they wiped them out. And basically, they're just boasting about themselves, how great they are. And then, as I mentioned, verse 12 comes along and God is saying, hey, when I'm done with my work, I'm going to judge you too for your arrogant heart and for your boastful eyes. Then verses 13 to 14, what happens again? Assyria, they continue to boast. But not only do they boast, they're saying they boast in themselves. They say, my strength, my hand, my wisdom, they have done it. And they have plundered all the nations. And then lastly, in verses 15 to 19, it gets pretty interesting. It says, "Does the axe raise itself above him who swings it?" And in other words, who has the power, the axe or the one who uses the axe? And God is making a comparison saying Assyrians are boasting in themselves and they are the axe. But God is the one wielding them. God is the one using them, giving them the power, and they can't see it. And as a result of that, in the last verses, it says, "The light of Israel will become a fire, their Holy One a flame. In their single day it will burn and consume his thorns and his briars." It will consume Assyria and it will destroy them, and they will be destroyed. And that is a fairly brief summary of the passage. But what's the point? What's the point that the prophet is making, and why is God going to judge Syria? It's because of their pride. It's because of arrogance. And God is punishing them and going to the extent to destroy them, because pride is a spiritual disease to Christians, and God knows it. And so all I want to explain today is, what is pride? Pride is it's spiritual cancer. It's a spiritual disease. And it can be easily argued, and I believe it's at the root of all sin. Because let's look at it in the Word. Because, the Word remains true. The devil became the devil because he was prideful. He wanted to be like God, and he wanted to sit on his throne. He wanted to be exalted high above him. But because God has no tolerance for pride, because God knows the severity of pride, he was cast out of heaven. And in Luke it says he fell from heaven like lightning. And then what happens after that? We see the garden, Eden, right? And the devil tempts in his proudness Adam and Eve, and he says, don't you want to be like God? Don't you want to know what it's like to know good and evil? And in their pride and falling to that temptation, they ate of an apple, and sin entered into the world. So the very beginning of sin is pride. And that's why I believe pride is at the root of all sin. And if it's at the root of all sin, then we got to come to understand this. We got to understand what pride is, and we have to be able to recognize what it is, and then we have to be able to figure out how to rid ourselves of this pride, or else we too will fall deep into be like the Assyrians essentially, and fall into our destruction, our demise. C.S. Lewis says this about pride. In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. C.S. Lewis goes as far to say that your pride means you don't know God. And that's an extremely bold statement. But in some senses, maybe us as Christians, we need to understand that pride truly is spiritual cancer. It is a disease. And how I like to put it today is, it's the Christian pandemic. And we really need to come to terms with this, because when we think about COVID-19, how much has the world changed? It's changed so much. Social distancing, masks, gloves, wiping down everything. Our work has changed. Quarantine, with the fact that we live in quarantine, so much of the world has changed. But with that, we now need to ask ourselves, if pride is the Christian pandemic, what has changed spiritually? What has changed inwardly to kill this pride? What precautions have we taken? And I think this is the challenge that we also have to get from this passage. What are we doing about pride? Because it's the root of all sin. It's extremely deathly, and we need to kill it. We need to rid ourselves of it. And the vaccine for pride is available. In the Bible, it says it's humility. It's humbleness. 1 Peter 5:5 says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And where is the greatest picture of humility? It's Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. And when Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, the message is this. Jesus, being the highest of highs, Jesus being king, comes down to the lowest of lows. He doesn't just come down as man. He brings himself low to that of a slave, because only slaves washed feet then, other people's feet. Jesus came down to the point, lowness of a slave, washed the feet of the disciples, and said, hey, if I am the highest of highs, if I'm the king that you look up to, no slave is greater than his master. So we too must be like Jesus and come down low. Because why? Because he said, blessed are the ones who do what I do. That's not the exact wording it says in John, but he says, blessed are those who do what I do. And in the translation, it really means happy, joyful, complete are the ones who serve like I serve. Because Jesus is saying that though he is the highest of highs, he comes down to the lowest of lows. Because the greatest joys in life is not when we are praised on a pedestal, but the greatest joys in life are when we come low and serve and help others. I didn't say it yet, but 1 Peter 5:5, like I said, it says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. But the very next verse says this, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. So if you get anything out of this, this is the truth. Christ, being the highest of highs, came to the lowest of lows. So we too will come to the lowest of lows like Jesus Christ, because in the end, we too will be exalted to the highest of highs. Amen.